So just looked at a report from via LBC on a Chinese official spreading a false tweet about Australia. And basically, the content of this purports to show an Australian soldier cutting the throat of an Afghan child. Um, so Scott Morrison's responded to this by calling it truly repugnant. And I quote here from LBC. Doesn't say who the reporter is. The graphic image was posted on Monday by Zhao Lijian, a spokesperson for China's foreign ministry, and shows a grinning soldier holding a bloody knife to the throat of a veiled child who is holding a lamb. And the tweet would seem to show the Australian flag sort of underneath this situation. Mr. Zhao wrote, shocked by murder of Afghan civilians and prisoners by Australian soldiers, we strongly condemn such acts and call for holding them accountable. Was a reference to a disturbing report by Australia's military earlier this month, which found evidence that elite Australian troops unlawfully killed 39 Afghan prisoners, farmers, and civilians during the conflict in Afghanistan. Okay, let me just address that point first. There have been allegations that Australian elite troops, um, like basically the Australian version of the SAS, have committed what would be war crimes in Afghanistan. I do think that should be taken seriously. I know that there has been widespread revulsion in Australia to the allegations. I've personally seen some photographs, one, for example, showing an Afghan man on the ground with prayer beads and a soldier appearing to shoot him. Um, these things are always very difficult because what goes on in a war zone, i.e., what is actually happening and what is purported to happen. You can imagine how much debate there is around police brutality videos in the streets of American or British cities, and the idea of what is actually happening versus what perspective are we looking at. So, in a war zone, thousands of miles away, that complexity is going to be even more exemplified. Having said that, I think it would be wrong for people to be too defensive and say, "Oh, our boys aren't capable of doing that." There have been examples of, frankly, some soldiers abusing their position. It happened during the Vietnam War. It's happened in more recent conflicts like the Iraq War. So this is not inconceivable. And Australia should take it seriously. And if those soldiers are found guilty, they should be robustly punished. Um, I don't agree with those who say that just because it's our boys, I mean, this applies to the UK as well, they should be protected because professional armies are meant to be behaving in a professional way. The pressure of the battlefield is never an excuse, in my opinion, for abusing civilians. So let me just get that out of the way, right? If these soldiers are found to be guilty, they should face consequences for that. But they should have a fair trial. I know a military guy who said this is going to be a repeat of um, the Shiner case. What he was referring to was a lawyer who was found to have exaggerated reports of um, you know abuse of civilians carried out by British troops, and a lot of that was actually turned out to be false evidence and exaggerated evidence. So it's a difficult situation because you kind of have two extremes. On one hand, you say, "Oh, this just shows the imperialistic West, and the troops are brutal and so on." But you do get a defensive attitude as well as soldiers aren't capable of doing this. Well, actually, they are. They're human beings, and you know it's happened before. So let's not just outright dismiss it. Right. That having been said, the Chinese regime is in absolutely no position to point fingers at the West. And that's the reason why. Until they acknowledge that 31 years ago, Tiananmen Square crackdown, then they have no legitimacy whatsoever to lecture any country on abuse of civilians. Um, but this is typical of the Chinese regime. This particular photo, by the way, has no basis in fact. The Chinese Foreign Ministry is posting it as fact. That is reckless. It's not surprising. They're just trying to vilify Australia. Of all the Five Eyes nations, arguably Australia has really borne the brunt of Chinese distortion and Chinese arrogance. Remember when Prime Minister Morrison called for an independent inquiry into COVID? The Chinese regime lashed out. Now Chinese scientists are trying to claim that COVID began in India in summer 2019. But that report's been peer reviewed, and those who have looked at it have said it adds no further information about the origins of COVID. So I read that as a nationalistic attempt to shift blame from China, which isn't at all surprising. There's this might be coming from scientists, but I doubt that they've got much independence from the Chinese regime, given the way that Chinese whistleblowers were silenced earlier this year. But this unfortunately what they're doing here, they're posting out this photograph. And on Chinese social media, people will lap that up and say, oh, look at the terrible Australians murdering civilians. They can't lecture China. There'll be no room for objective thinking. They won't say it's been reported as this. They'll just report it as a fact. So it's industrial scale distortion, what the Chinese regime is doing. They're preventing Chinese people from hearing both sides. Um, and it's just another example, as far as I'm concerned, for us to take a robust line. Um, one, because Australia is an ally country. Two, because what they're doing to Australia, they're going to do it to Britain and France and the United States and Canada and any country that they feel is anti-China, but is actually um, just not towing the narrative that they want. Um, I really, really do feel we're at crossroads here. And every day the Chinese regime gets more arrogant and more emboldened until there is a collective effort to really stand up to them. This is going to continue. I was outraged recently by the reports that we give 81 million to China in aid. Now, if this was going to poor children, I wouldn't have a problem with that. But given the nature of the Chinese regime, that is, there's definitely question marks over that. Um, And I know of people who are critical of the cut in foreign aid, but concede that that is a problem, i.e., where the money is going. We absolutely shouldn't be giving £81 million to a regime that continues to insult and try to undermine us. It makes no sense. I am convinced that there is a lot more that we can do. Um, and there is still too many people in positions of authority that think that it should be business as normal. Sir Mark Stillwell, I think I'm getting his name right, the civil servant who's just stepped down, has said that whilst China is a threat, we shouldn't take a belligerent approach. Um, that is, in my opinion, extremely wrong footed. We have tried this for years. The West has tried to placate China. We kind of thought, okay, with their economic rise, then we could work with China. There would be changes politically, but it's very clear that this regime hasn't changed. They haven't become more transparent. They lied to the world about COVID. They tried to cover it up. How long are we going to just sort of think this can be business as normal? It can't. I accept that we can't totally cut off all links. There may be areas like climate change we need to work with China on, maybe even issues like piracy and stuff like that to a lesser extent. But I do think we need to take a much more robust line. I mean, Australia has the right idea. Morrison's demanded an apology. When China insults us, we shouldn't just say we're disappointed. Typical British underspeak. We need to basically bite back. We need to start making demands of China. Why aren't we doing that? I feel one of the problems with this country, and I love my country, but I feel that too often we sit on the fence until it's too late. Too often we take this attitude of cautious diplomacy over frankly blunt language. Now, I quite like Dominic Raab. I think he's a decent foreign secretary, but I believe he could do more. I believe the government can do more. I mean, Johnson done a U-turn on Huawei, but that took some convincing. Um, if Brexit's about taking back control, let's prove it. Let's stand up to China. I'm sick and tired of seeing Beijing get away with stuff like this. We need to stand robustly with Australia. Talking about the war crimes, okay, that needs to be investigated. This is a fake photo that a Chinese diplomat has posted as a fact. And it's, you can imagine if a Western diplomat done that with just made up something that happened in China, China would be fuming. You know, there'd be boycotts of Western goods. There would be Chinese students would be protesting on Western university campuses. So, as far as I'm concerned, we need to send out a message. We're not going to take your arrogance anymore. You're not going to push us around. As far as I'm concerned, when China insults Australia, they're insulting us. Same with Canada, the same with the United States, the same with any Western country. Why? Because we're talking about shared values, shared stakes. I believe that China threatens to undermine the world. I really do. And it would be unforgivable if that happens on the watch of those who are in power right now. I mean, it isn't just the government I'm talking about. Ofcom. I'm furious with Ofcom due to their completely weak attitude to CGTN. I mentioned before, I contacted them about this. I launched a petition. They came back with its response that they were inclined to give off CGTN a fine. Not good enough. They need to strip its license completely. Why the hell should a network that has aired forced confessions of British citizens be allowed any voice in this country? Why should they be given a platform? That isn't an asset to free speech, that's a threat to free speech. Um, University departments, these greedy universities that care more about Chinese money than they do about Western values. And what I base that on, you just need to look at their websites. All it is glowing praise for China, yet they won't do anything to, for example, discipline Chinese students who are bullying their peers and threatening their peers. And I believe that they're probably being coerced by the Chinese embassy. That's absolute moral cowardice. I feel very strongly about that. And finally, Chinese nationals in the UK, whether they be students or business people or tourists, probably not tourists at this time, but um, I'll say what I always say. I've not got issues with them in principle, but I would say they need to remember that they're no longer in China and they're not here to promote the CCP. I mean, I've been watching the old comedy Mind Your Language. It's a comedy about an English teacher in a adult education centre in London. It's very funny, but one of the characters is a young Chinese woman. She's a stereotypical communist, and she's always quoting out lines by Chairman Mao. Now that's a comedy, and it's pretty funny. Uh, you wouldn't get Chinese nationals quoting Mao today. What they might do, however, is demand that the Chinese flag is respected. So what we've actually seen is a transition from ideological communism to ideological nationalism, and it's just as dangerous. I mean, communism's a failed ideology, and they know that. I think they know that. So instead, they're focusing on promoting Chinese nationalism. We need to be very robust and say, look, you're welcome here, but you're going to respect this country. You're not here to promote Chinese nationalism. And more often than not, there is demands, that Western countries respect China when they show no respect in return. I mean, we are very far from 5 years ago when David Cameron welcomed Xi Jinping to his local pub and it was all, smiled for the camera. Unfortunately, that was a facade. It would be nice if it was for real, but it was a facade, a diplomatic facade. So we need to accept the reality. We cannot trust the CCP. And if there's a new Cold War type situation with China, it's entirely of China's making because of its belligerent behavior, because of its lack of transparency, because of its arrogant and jingoistic demands for respect whilst showing little in return.